if you're going to put in a certain amount of planning for strikes with weapons on target, why would you not do the same level of planning and understanding for trying to go pick up a survivor in a high or medium threat environment?
Hello, welcome to the Fighter Pilot Podcast. I'm not your usual host, giving Jello a break this week. I'm Matt Arney, call sign Flounder, and it's great to be here at the studios at Gillespie Airfield with the Circle Air Group. And today, we're going to dig into combat search and rescue, and I thought no better than to invite my good friend Tamara Graham. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate that.
Yeah, it's great to have you on here. I know you kind of live in the area, but let's start off with getting to know you and what your background is and how you joined the Navy.
Yeah, no worries. So I was an Air Force brat, so I was a little attuned to military aviation, and I was raised with the mindset that you're going to college. We don't know how we're going to pay for it, but you're going to college. So I had a little bit of a mercenary plan of, well, maybe I can have the Navy pay for me to go to school, which is what I ended up doing. So I went to college at the University of Virginia on an ROTC scholarship.
Go Who's?
Yep. Wahoo Wah. Was not planning on staying in at all. I was just going to do my 4 and be done. And I very specifically remember I flew in a TA-4, in fact, with then Lieutenant Satan Khan.
Oh, really?
In VF-43 when we had aggressor squadrons. And I thought, this is kind of cool, but it's not really what I expected. Clouds aren't whipping by my head. I'm like, I'm not sure if I want to do this. And then the next week with the Marines, I got to fly in a 53. And I was sitting between the two co-pilots, and we're yanking and banking over treetops in a lake, and I'm like, this is what I want to do. And so from then on, I was kind of hooked on going naval aviation. The commitment was huge, but I sat there in the auditorium thinking about it, going, I'm going to have to be 32 anyway. I might as well do something fun. So that's how I ended up getting down the aviation path. And because I knew I wanted to fly helos, I requested to be stashed in a helicopter squadron or wing. And so I started as a stash ensign down in Jacksonville, Florida, at the HS wing, and that is the community I ended up moving into after making it through flight school. So
wonderful. Did you have the bug of aviation before that TA-4 ride?
I had the bug of adventure.
Okay.
I was a certified diver since I was 16. I thought I wanted to be a paratrooper. I just wanted to do anything that was fun and adventurous, and the idea of being just over the treetops, cruising around seemed awesome. And admittedly, not to frustrate any of the audience out there, if A6s were still viable, that would have been my first choice, because low to the ground was kind of where I wanted to be flying. So
yeah, that's good. So you go on to flight school, and you worked your way through primary, intermediate, advanced, and then you said you went back to Jacksonville into the HS community, or did you come out to San Diego?
There was a wait to start flight school, so I had to wait about 6 months, and so they just basically put us in various aviation squadrons and things. So that was my time in Jacksonville. So after I went through flight school and got my wings, I was lucky enough to have my first choice, and I said, I'm a single woman, I'd like to go to San Diego. so that's where I ended up going from there.
Yeah, okay. And so you go through the FRS out here at San Diego, and then what was the first tour?
My first squadron was HS6. That's part of Air Wing 11. Got a chance to deploy a couple times. In fact, my first deployment was on the Kitty Hawk. So when we switched carriers and moved to the Carl Vinson, it was very exciting. They actually have Hollywood showers, all that fun stuff. But I was blessed in the fact that because of my timing, I was able to go to MOTS, become kind of a CSAR training officer.
Oh, great.
As we were bringing on board the Hellfire missile system for our HH-60 aircraft that we had. My second deployment, I was a senior JO, so got to do some actual real-world alerts during, it was Operation Desert Fox, and then certainly the Operation Southern Watch events that continued to go on. So forward deployed in Kuwait for that process. Mm-hmm. And once my time there was done, I ended up being a RAG instructor. So stayed in San Diego teaching the mighty H-60 to the new fracs coming through.
Got it. And so which variant of the H-60 are we talking about here?
So the HS community flies two of them. One is the Foxtrot, which has a dipping sonar system. So that's for anti-submarine warfare. You can drop torpedoes. Basically, we did carrier interzone defense, so defending the aircraft carrier from the submarine threat. And then the other variant was the HH, or well, as we call it, just the hotel. And that was for naval special warfare, so working with the SEALs. It has a Hellfire missile system on it, so you can do anti-surface warfare with it. And then that's also what we do for combat search and rescue, because it has multiple aspects of equipment that allow you to fly in up to a medium threat environment and still remain survivable. So those are the aircraft that we would typically save for those special mission sets, depending on what we were doing. So any day in an HS squadron, you could be moving stuff from point A to point B, you could be hunting submarines, or you could be taking out, small boats, or, preparing for combat search and rescue stuff. So it was always an interesting potpourri that kept the days interesting. So.
That's good. And so you had Foxtrots and hotels in the squadron. Yep. On the aircraft carrier. And like going through the FRS, did you fly both models going through the FRS?
The hotels are kind of like precious assets, so they were only in the fleet. So we learned some of the flight missions like terrain flying skills and qualifications in the Foxtrot, where we just what we call trucked it out. So we got rid of all the ASW gear so it was lighter. And then you could take it out in the desert and do brownout landings, do all the tactical form. We did all sorts of like duct taping the cockpit so that light leaks wouldn't kill you with your night vision goggles on. But the hotels, they stayed in the fleet. And typically what we try to do as a community, you were only assigned 2, but a 2 to make 2 aircraft mission is not destined for success. So whenever you were getting ready on deployment, typically a squadron that was still in maintenance phase would hand over one of their H's. So we deploy with a 3 and 4 mix. So 4 Foxtrots, 3 hotels, and so that we always had 3 to make 2 for any mission sets that might come up.
With the hotels and Foxtrots, as a pilot, I mean, are they noticeably different in flying characteristics, or do they pretty much fly the same, obviously depending on load and that kind of stuff?
They fly the same for the most part. From a functional standpoint with crew, getting people in and out of the hotel is much easier. It's designed for night vision goggles, so it's, the cockpit is already compatible for that. You don't have to do any kind of crazy stuff with blue glass to cover up lights and those types of things. And then you have a slight power degradation with the HERS that are on our engines, which basically reduce our IR signature. So for the most part, a 60 flies like a 60. Typically, the hotels would be slightly lighter because you don't have all the ASW gear in the back, which makes it a little bit more sporty. A little less comfortable in the front because you're also covered in a Kevlar seat. So a little harder on the back over the course of all those hours. But for the most part, they fly similarly.
Okay. So I distinctly remember, as a little teaser for our viewers on the CSAR aspect of our conversation we'll get into, but one time when I was at JAUT in Fallon, they did the whole, hey, we need a couple survivors
You're the
to go out.
The lucky winner.
Yeah, exactly. And I was, adventurous spirit. Hey, get me out in the desert. And so my buddy and I clapped Downing, and we, as survivors, they put us in a canyon, and we decided, well, let's go up. And so we go up, make our way up, and got better radio reception. And then at the end of it, I remember watching the helos kind of coming up the canyon. I was like, look up at your right 3 o'clock. And they finally come up, but they couldn't, because of the terrain, they couldn't land there and pick us up. But I remember, and I can still picture it to this day, that helo coming across with SEALs out the sides, and all the armaments and stuff. I'm like, that is badass. Yeah. So that was a hotel then? That
is correct.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Just really quickly on other variants, because I recall there being Bravos.
Yeah. So what was then the HSL community, the LAMPS community, they are stationed on the small boys, so your destroyers, your cruisers, and their primary mission, again, is anti-submarine warfare, but they don't have the dipping sonar system. They would have buoys and then a buoy processor. They also had ESM gear and radar. So those were 2 sensors that we never had in my community, so we were happily dumb and blind out there, like making our way through the world. So they would leverage those assets to support the SSC, the surface search piece of working for the Desron, trying to figure out all the different ships that are out there, so that the strike group knows who's where and what they're doing. And then we would work with them for submarine hunting as well. So we're considered the pouncer. So they would find and then kind of localize, and then we would come in and do the kind of near-term terminal action when it came to hunting down submarines. So.
With the
Mark 48.
48.
And Mark 54 kind of came along just towards the end of my time flying Foxtrots.
Okay. Just to kind of finish off the 60 variants, because now we have the Romeo and the Sierra, right?
Yes.
And so actually backing up, which was that, the Foxtrot?
So
or both?
back in my day, it was the 46 did vert rep.
Oh,
And so they were on all the supply ships when the 46 needed to be replaced. And so that was part of the thought process of making an all F-18, all 60 Navy plus the E-2 to kind of streamline logistics. And so the original Block 1 Sierras came out and replaced the 46. So they just basically had nothing on them. They're just kind of trucked out light birds, kind of like an Army Black Hawk.
attached to the supply ship.
Attached to supply ships.
Okay.
And they were also deployed on the amphibious assault ships. So you're like, Essex, Kearsarge, those types of large ships that support the Marine Expeditionary Unit. So
Okay.
as we eventually transitioned, our squadrons went from HS to HSC, and then we lost the ASW mission, and then we took on the Block 3 Sierras that had the aircraft survivability equipment associated with it, more tanks in the back because there's not a lot of gas in a Sierra. And we were lucky in both the hotels and the Foxtrots, you could have external tanks that would actually increase your legs quite a bit in support of especially things like CSAR to be able to get a little further out and back. And then the Bravo's transition to the 60 Romeo, which basically they threw everything on that thing. It's got the dipping sonar, which is now the ALFs, and they have the buoy launchers, the radar, the ESM. So the back end of that aircraft is just full of all sorts of trons that typically your air crewman is running and helping process. And they still are associated with being on the small ships in the strike group, but then they've also put an element on the big deck as part of like what at the time was the new air wing makeup, which I never quite made it to. I departed the pattern before we fully got out to sea with the new air wing after transitioning. So
Yeah, okay. So that's all the 60 variants in a nutshell. One more thing about the 60, because I had the pleasure of having a 60 Sierra Sardat when I was at Whidbey Island.
Yep.
Loved going flying with them, doing search and rescue in the mountains and such. But it wasn't just the pilots up front. So who else was in that airplane when you were flying it?
Oh, yeah. And I will say it's one of the things I absolutely love about my community is that we work with enlisted aircrew. They are an awesome and crazy bunch, and they keep you on your toes. In our community, they are responsible for operating the sonar system and helping prosecute submarines when you're doing that mission, and then switch over to doing the work with the SEALs or Special Forces as well as CSAR. Now they're your door gunners. So they go through a lot of practice in how to operate small arms fire out of the window while you're moving. So there's a lot of complexity to that process. And then they also train for the terminal area of recovery. So they have pretty decent, they're not quite at the PJ level because they don't get the same level of medical training.
PJ being?
The parajumpers they are the kind of soft air crew for, I air quote because, I have a Navy bias, but for the Jolly Greens, which are the rescue element for the Air Force.
Okay.
They have a little bit more focused training. Our guys typically are first responder medical training, but they work on dual man tactics in an LZ or landing zone, how they're going to defend the downed aviator, how they're like checking the environment, carrying people back. I'll never forget one event. I was actually the evaluator for an air wing, and the lucky survivor was a Marine, I think first lieutenant. He was a Samoan guy who was probably 6'3", 250 pounds. And so we decided, of course, just to be nice, we were going to put him down a berm with a broken leg.
Yeah.
And so the poor crewmen are trying to figure out how to carry this dude through the sand dunes back to the aircraft. But those are the things they practice to do, and there's a lot of complexity to the process. So they end up having to develop a lot of different skill sets. And again, one day they might be doing that kind of stuff, and the next day they're looking at grams across a field to figure out what's the submarine and what's
That's incredible.
Yeah.
What a great opportunity for our sailors.
It's very much a team effort between the front in the cockpit and the back on how you do business. And especially on the flying side, you can't see behind you when you're flying, but in order to stay out of most radar cross sections, we fly close to terrain. So usually within one rotor diameter, a radar can't break you out. So those guys are clearing your tail when you're popping over ridge lines, when you're coming around left or right to make sure you're not about to turn into anything, and keeping an eye on your wingman as well as any other threats that are out there. So if you've got, someone launching a man pad for an IR system or infrared seeking missile, that they'll, hey, smoke, 7 o'clock, so they start helping us out as far as the defending the aircraft piece as well. So yeah, it's fun.
Yeah.
You develop great relationships when you do that kind of stuff with your crewmen, and you really work as a team, and which is one of the reasons I've always loved the environment.
Yeah, it really is special, and I got to enjoy that a few times on some helicopter flights, but it is something to be part of. And I wrote some things about that. The team dynamic is when you really try to get a high-performing team, that's where you can see that in action in very challenging situations with a proficient crew. It's really amazing to observe.
Yeah, and I'm sure in Washington State, they do some pretty hairy mountain rescues because all the folks that are putting their crampons on and heading up to Mount Rainier that don't know what they're getting into. We've got what we call a force penetrator that you got to drop down through the high trees and trying to hold a hover in the mountain winds while you're talking with your crewmen, and you got another guy down the line working a litter rig for somebody who's injured. I mean, it's just, there's a lot of dynamics to it. And so those guys do great work.
That's right. And when all the local search and rescue elements can't get to that situation, they're calling the Navy.
Yep.
And the Navy can make it happen. Just to close out the air crewman side, so in the Romeo and Sierra, similar thing that you're going to have?
Kind of a different makeup. Typically, there's only one crewman in the back of a Romeo who's doing more of that sensor operator stuff. In the back of a Sierra, you have two crewmen to make sure you've got visibility out both sides because you do a lot more kind of close-in maneuvering, and they are typically more in a door gunner or search and rescue swimmer role in the back of the aircraft. So
okay. Going back into your career, one of the things you mentioned was MOTS. So what is MOTS and what did you do there?
It's the Marine Squadron, and I'm going to probably not remember the acronym well.
It stands for MOTS.
Yes, MOTS. Marine Aviation Training Squadron, I think is what it is. It's basically the Marines' Top Gun. And there are 6 functions to Marine Corps Aviation. They drive that into your head. It's an incredibly professional school out in Yuma, Arizona. They give the Navy a couple spots on occasion. And so when I went through, again, I was chosen because I was going to roll into a CSAR training officer role in my squadron, and we were getting the Hellfire missile system. So I went through the SKIDS program, which is the Cobras and the Hueys. Also in my class were a number of backseaters from Tomcats and or Super Hornets doing their FAC-A quals. So we had a real small smattering of Navy folks and then Marine aviators. And literally a buddy of mine from flight school was a 46 guy, and he took 2 weeks of leave off to study in preparation because it was super, super intensive. We had class 6 days a week. You had like these epically professional briefs. At the end, there was 5 minutes. You had time to go to the bathroom, come back. You had to have your coffee in your MOTS mug with a lid. And then there were tests that were classified every 5 days. And so it was great to see kind of that level of professionalism in training to absorb all that from our, I don't want to say sister service, but as also naval aviators and kind of how they work. And then the level of support, the senior leaders that would come to that Task Force 160th to come and give us briefs. And I remember watching a video. There was a warrant officer who was Task Force 160th, and he'd been in Mogadishu for the Black Hawk Down scenario, and he'd been in the C-2 Bird, and he is showing us FLIR footage from his aircraft as one of the helos is literally taking RPG rounds off the rotor hub, rock solid hover as they're putting like their stick down the rope, and I'm just kind of like, that is amazing. And he had over 10,000 flight hours, over 4,000 on goggles. And there was not a soul in the room that didn't address him as sir, even though he was probably junior to most people in rank. I remember watching the movie Black Hawk Down and seeing that scene in the movie. And I was like, oh my God, that's exactly what happened.
It went down.
That's exactly how it happened. So
that's amazing.
Yeah, super, super impressive. But the school was great. Got to work with a lot of great aviators. Marine Corps mindset is very different. Relative to CSAR, they do what's called TRAP, which is tactical recovery of aircraft and personnel. Like most Marine stuff, we're just going to bring a bunch of stuff in and control the area and tell everybody to back off, take what we want, and get out of there. So we kind of work through some of those things, and they bring in national assets. The course only goes on twice a year. So you got satellites overhead when you start doing the exercises and those types of things. So it was a great experience working in the desert, bringing lots of different stuff together to kind of see how the Marine Corps does it in a very kind of ground-centric role because their aviation arm is meant to support the Marines on the ground, which is a great perspective for a helicopter.
That's right. Yeah. And so then you do that, you become the CSAR training officer in your squadron, and then you said you went to FRS as an instructor.
Yep.
Where did your career take you from that point?
After my time as an instructor pilot, I was lucky enough to, it was actually while I was there that 9/11 occurred. So as I said, I hadn't planned on making a career in the Navy. 9/11 occurred, and I'm like, well, I'm not getting out now.
Mm-hmm.
My community didn't have training officers, but I had been asked by one of the local COs if I'd be willing to come be a super JO for him and kind of fill the training officer role. So I said, hey, Skipper Cruzy, I'm in. In fact, ironically, it was in HS4.
Okay.
My eventual squadron that I commanded. They kind of went, well, yeah, no, I don't know if we're going to do that. So go back to kind of the normal detailing process. And so I didn't get the opportunity to go right back to sea after 9/11, but I did get a great job in working at what is our training CARGRU. And basically it's an admiral who has a staff that goes out and evaluates every air wing and certifies them ready to actually go out to sea, as we say, blue water, so away from any land or divert, to be able to operate the full spectrum of missions for the carrier strike group. And so my focus in the air shop was CSAR, the EOD guys, explosive ordnance folks, and then most general helicopter operation stuff. So, which was great because then you get to go out to sea for about 3 weeks on every carrier on the West Coast and see how they operate. Again, the talent level and the interest. I very much remember being out with, I think it was VFA 32, and working with one of their department heads who was good friends with Vince Lillette, who I went to college with, as you know, and had just recently had to eject over Iraq. And so there was a very solid mindset within the community that this is not only important, CSAR that is, it's really important for our command. Like it could be us out there, and we need to make sure that we know what we're doing. So a real dedicated effort with most of the folks when we did the Com2Xs on trying to make sure they learned everything they could, they got as good as they could get, and then looked at opportunities to continue to improve as their training continued. So that was great. It's always good when you have a team effort on the mindset there.
That's right. It's very important for that to come together. And just as a refresher, so basically, if you can imagine all the different squadrons of the air wing, they do their own individual advanced readiness program, and then once they get to a certain level of squadrons, bring them together, go out to the ship just to do basic, let's land on the ship and make sure we're getting that down right. And then we go to Air Wing Fallon, where we do all these kinds of mission sets, strikes, CSARs, all that kind of stuff out in Fallon. And now let's bring that to the ship, Comp2X in the ideal workup process. And now we're doing all that. And so you guys are evaluating the air wing and ship performance to certify them ready to deploy after the Comp2X. So a very important part of the process. So you finish that up.
Yeah, and then my time there, I was selected to go to the SWITty course, which is the helicopter equivalent of Top Gun, which had been stood up. We didn't have one when I went to MOTS, which is kind of why MOTS was, they spot that we would go. And so I went back and as a very junior 04 and became a Seahawk weapons and tactics instructor going through the course up at Nautic. Came back and then went to do my department head tour at HS8, which was part of Air Wing 9 at the time, and that was back in around 2004-05 timeframe.
Okay.
That was a great experience. Department head's always like a interesting ride. My CO was really forward-leaning. He knew a little bit about my background, so he's like, unless you really dreamed of being an admin officer, I don't want you doing that. I want you to be my plans officer and ops, and we're going to push the envelope on how we integrate with the air wing and the things that we're going to do out there. And so we had, I got there just in time for the start of our HARP, as you just alluded to. That's the Helicopter Advanced Readiness Program, which is the start of the workups. Got up to Fallon, was able to kind of coordinate a lot of those events, and then went on deployment on the Carl Vinson. And that was probably one of the most rewarding experiences because when we got there, we actually detached from the air wing and we forward deployed up into Iraq, and we were working for MND Southeast, which was the British sector of Iraq.
Where were you flying out of?
Basra, and then also out of Camp Arifjan in Kuwait. So most of our enlisted folks stayed in Arifjan in Kuwait to support the aircraft, and then we would go up to Basra and then move up from there depending on what the mission was. So not a CSAR event, like we were not standing alert for anything given kind of the maturity of the theater, but we're doing a lot of ISR or intelligence, spent a lot of time working our way up the waterways that border Iran and keep an eye on the traffic there, as as well as what was going on in the southeastern corridors, and supporting the SEALs mostly, which was, again, really interesting stuff in order to try and work through what was pretty much just a man-pad threat, or your kind of like pervasive small IR missile. You stay low and dual ship tactics, and you stay on the move. So it was just about the best flying you could do. And we probably shouldn't say this on the record, but our standard when we fly in training is a hard deck of 100 feet. So you usually aim for about 150 feet above terrain. And when we were in Iraq, we flew at 50. And it was weird to try and get used to that to begin with. We practiced it as we were in transit. But man, by the end, you got to be super reactive. But it is incredibly exciting, like just really great flying. And then obviously there's just so much to pay attention to as we were helping support some of the convoys that were going up and down the main supply routes, or the MSRs, out of Kuwait up into the middle of Iraq and whatnot. And you're on the lookout for things like, I mean, it's crazy the stuff you learn. Being a Navy pilot, you're not used to kind of the Army stuff, but the Army guys are there and they're like, hey, let us know if you see any dead cattle on the side of the road, because people would stuff IEDs in them. And then, they'd be like, oh, let's get this dead animal out of the road. And then it would, take some folks out. So we were always on the lookout for those anomalies that we could radio back to the convoy to make sure they knew what was going on and keep an eye on any threats that might be coming their way.
Yeah. Wonderful, wonderful work. So I think there was some more college time in there.
After I was lucky enough to go to War College after my department head tour, so a year of being a student, which was...
I think we actually overlapped at that time.
Yeah, I think so.
Because you were 07, 08, same as me, in the normal academic year, August to May.
So I came in that second trimester.
Okay, got it.
So I got the doubly good deal of having the summer off, which was awesome. And it was amazing. I think at the time, CNO Mullen had said, why am I not filling the Navy's premier, or actually DOD's premier graduate school with naval officers, because we pretty much do you don't need to go to school, just go to sea and you'll learn everything you need to. So there was a big push, as you might remember, to get upwardly mobile folks into the senior war college at the time. So I was a beneficiary of that, as were a lot of my buds that were department heads in Air Wing 9 and across the seawall. So it was great. The number of aviators that were floating around going through the senior war college and telling sea stories and trying to read Clausewitz without falling asleep.
Yeah, that's right. There was some good times. And then you screened for command.
Yeah, I graduated in March, and literally I had orders to my joint tour, which was with a Special Ops Command in Hawaii, SOCPAC, and I was driving cross-country to ship my car out of the West Coast when I got the phone call saying, hey, we've selected you to be a CO. That's awesome.
Yeah, that's great. And so that was with the other Black Knights.
Yes. I won't tell the renaming story because I still feel guilty about it, but but yes, for the viewers out there, we were XOs and COs together in CAG 14, and Flounder was the skipper of VFA 154 Black Knights, and we were HS4 Black Knights.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So good fun.
Yeah.
Many times you'll see, there's always teasing each other on things. And so when you end up with two squadrons in the same air wing with Black Knights as the name, there's bound to be. And especially, I will say, because one of the things I enjoyed throughout my time was, I think, the special relationship that the 2-seat squadrons had with the Hilo squadrons. Because we were FACAs and we did Rescue Mission Commander, so we worked very closely on these things. And so then to have both of them be Black Knight squadrons was just icing on the cake.
Yeah, no, that was awesome. And in fact, 154 was in my air wing when I was a department head, and we were lucky enough, because we'd forward deployed, we didn't have an intel officer at the time, or we didn't have an IS, so an intel specialist. And a second-class petty officer had just come to 154, and it was kind of like, hey, we got plenty of people. Do you want to sit in civic and, do kindergarten stuff? And he's like, no. And he'd worked with the SEALs. So 154 was gracious enough to give him to us. And so he literally sat with us in Iraq for about 5 months because we had an extended deployment. And he was the sole generator of mission reports. And he would take all our pictures and generate amazing intel products. And, as I've always said, communication is the most important thing we do and the hardest thing we do. And so the good work that was going on, nobody would have known about it, and it wouldn't have made a difference if it weren't for IS2 Crow as he put that stuff together and put it up into the system so leadership could understand what was going on, where boats were when
That's
they were
great.
moving. Yeah, super impressive. And again, I highlight that as the team aspect of our enlisted corps that does some really incredible stuff that really makes a difference.
One of the unsung heroes. I know there's a little bit of career left. I want to kind of hold that as we get into combat search and rescue a little more as a topic. So you've had a lot of combat search and rescue training and instructing. So can you give us a little bit of history on CSAR?
Yeah, it's not a good history for the most part. Luckily, we're a learning organization and we learn from our mistakes, but certainly the advent of helicopters made life a little bit easier in the world of, hey, we've lost a TAC air pilot over land. What are we going to do about it? And you can send an asset in. And so hopefully the audience has, if not read the book, seen the movie Devotion.
Exactly what I was thinking about.
Yeah, I had read the autobiography of Ensign Brown. And as I read it, it was very much done from a personal standpoint, like lots of letters and kind of his upbringing and his life at home. And it didn't talk a lot about his time at sea. And as an aviator, I was like, well, I want to know what he did. Like, what was he doing on deployment? So when Devotion came out, I got that and I read it. And it was just, it's such an incredible story, and it speaks to the camaraderie that is naval aviation. I use this term in a gender-neutral way, the brotherhood and the fraternity that exists amongst aviators, and I think that's at the core of why we care about combat search and rescue, because we don't want to leave anybody behind. The advent of that was with Eisenhower in 1955, and the generating the code of conduct, what it means if you are behind enemy lines and you're captured. How do you maintain your duty and your dignity and your support to your country while dealing with all the horrible things that occur when you're actually a prisoner of war. So those things kind of generated together. There were a number of events in Korea, but it was all very kind of ad hocery. Somebody's down. Can you guys fly out here and do it? Not a big plan. Fast forward, we have Vietnam, and Air Force was doing a fair amount of combat search and rescue. Navy was doing it north of, I think, the Red River. But we were kind of set up to fail in the fact that any Navy aircraft is going to have to cross the coastline, which is covered with AAA and air defenses. So we were really setting ourselves up for a fair amount of risk. So although history of Navy helos, HC-3, HC-7, the Sea Wolves, the Sea Devils, they did some amazing stuff. They were dedicated to the mission. I think over 148 rescues over the course of Vietnam. But at the same time, I think we lost over 100 aircraft in attempting to recover downed aviators. So that's not good math, relatively speaking. So I will say, like, most of the aircraft lost were fixed-wing aircraft in support, either like looking for their wingman who's been shot down and getting hit, or helping try and escort the recovery asset in and getting taken down. So,
like, I recall in some of the stories, the A-1 Sky Raiders that would go in there, and unfortunately some of them would get lost while they're trying to suppress things around the area and stuff like that.
And there was a thought process that said, hey, this is an important mission. We don't want to leave these guys behind. They're ours, for one, part of our air crew, and then also they're an asset to the enemy. We need to make sure we're working to recover them, but we need to do it in a way where we're not losing, half our assets to make it happen. And how is that fitting in the big picture of the war? So the thought process afterward was kind of like, we need a better plan. We need to really think about this and make it a more dedicated mission. If you're going to put in a certain amount of planning for strikes with weapons on target, like, why would you not do the same level of planning and understanding for trying to go pick up a survivor in a high or medium threat environment? So that kind of came along. At the same time, we went to more of a Cold War blue water Navy where there was less of a need for those types of mission sets. So as a community in helicopters, we kind of got rid of a lot of those skill sets and we didn't practice them as much. And most of those assets went to our reserve corps. Around the 90s, when we got the hotels, there was that recognition that, hey, it's a quick and dynamic mission. Navy is expeditionary. It's part of the air wing. How do we create an organic capability to do this, which is when we started really kind of digging into CSAR in the early 90s, because we'd gone again from, the blue water Cold War Navy to, we're doing power projection in a very focused manner at various places around the world where this is probably a more credible skill to have in the onesie twosies that we're going to use it. So So I was lucky that, I got commissioned in 1993. For one, I was lucky they had just removed the combat exclusion law. So I was
going to ask you about that.
I was going to say, as a woman, like 2 months before I got commissioned, I was then open to fly any aircraft and deploy on any ship. So I got to go do, like the good stuff that I've been able to experience. But that was also the same time frame they started looking at how do we kind of ramp this up in a more thoughtful way, train to it more, and it became kind of an integral part of Air Wing Fallon and our training syllabus in the HS community. So.
Yeah, I mean it is really interesting. You talk about that time period of the 80s. It's the Soviets, the big wars, the war on the continent in Europe that we're training for. It's the anti-submarine efforts going on. So I can completely see why people would kind of drop CSAR off the list of things that you got to worry about.
Yep.
And then we get into the period of the 90s after the Gulf War in 91, where I'm sure we had some experiences there. And then probably a lot of PJs picking up downed aviators.
Well,
there.
luckily they didn't shoot down too many people. That was a pretty quick process. But yeah, we did have a couple events, and I don't know that Navy executed any of them.
I doubt it.
Typically, Air Force is the primary for overland SAR of any kind, and certainly in a developed theater, they are on the ready to do those things. We've always kind of fought our way in if it's from the developed theater standpoint. Certainly if it's just us as an air wing and a strike group, there's no one else out there that can get there that quick. So, and in the past, it was different by coast that I think it was the East Coast carriers would deploy with a SEAL team on board the carrier. And so we would also work with them because another opportunity for recovery is to go into a medium threat environment, insert a SEAL team. They go in, find and recover the aviator, egress out, and then we pick everybody up. So it's kind of a two-tiered plan to deal with whatever threat levels there were. So those are also kind of quick reaction options that you bring to the table as just a core Navy unit. So
Then we get in, like you alluded to, in our time in the 90s where we're working CSAR and Rescue Mission Commander and both sides of that. So from your perspective in the helo, what did those kind of missions look like? What was if you could say, generic CSAR mission, but what did that look like and who were you working with?
Yeah, so CSAR package is a rescue unit, or typically 2 for mutual support, then a rescue escort, which would usually in our case be the F-18s. I will be honest, probably my favorite escort is the A-10, and they're the Sandys for the Air Force because, for one, they have long legs, they live down low, they have that 30-millimeter cannon. They can just bring a lot to bear and kind of keep eyes on where we are. So they're a little bit more attuned to the low level and not losing track of us as we're kind of scooting through the trees.
Yeah.
I know it's hard from above when you're up there at 25,000 feet going, where the hell's the helicopters? I have no idea what spider point they at.
That's right.
And then you'd have an RMC or Rescue Mission Commander, and again that would usually fall to the 2-seat squadron with the WIZO or Rio working the problem. And so your job, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, sitting on high, is we usually launch knowing at least the general area of the survivor, because otherwise search is not what you do in combat. It's recovery, and it's the terminal area that you might be searching, but for the most part you want to know where that individual is so that you can get them. So the RMC would get on top, kind of coordinate the general package, keep eyes on the survivor, trying to authenticate them, and then keep the package moving to kind of help them know what's going on. And then as we would push in from whatever that last point is to actually execute the recovery, working through a checklist to make sure we'd met everything we needed to, you guys would also come in and defend us. If there's, you get some small threats coming in, here comes the Jeeps, here comes the guys with the 50 cals strapped to stuff.
Onto their Toyota.
Yeah, which I'm sure was probably the fun part as you're diving down doing a little close air support as we're trying to find some guy with his laser pointers and stuff. And you're like, oh my God, what are we doing?
That's right. No more of the bringing in the cast guy. I want this one.
Yeah.
So we're going to come in and work it in the terminal area.
Yeah. And then, of course, as with everything in the air wing, the E2 is up there kind of managing the big picture and looking for threats, because the other side of the coin is that if you don't have air superiority, again, we could be losing folks on the way to try and recover somebody, as well as the challenge of what's coming our way, and we need to know how we defend against that and whether we need to kind of call it off if we've raised the threat level too high.
Yeah, if it's too high a threat for what you have available to you. You mentioned the res court, so you might have them in kind of a counter air mindset if you don't have air superiority. And then also something shot down that person there.
Yep.
So there is a threat that's viable. And so as you're down there trying to locate, authenticate, maybe comms with the survivor's problem. So you have to get down lower. And
I wouldn't say maybe. It's
yes,
always
the problem.
Comms was always probably the biggest challenge in executing CSAR.
That's right.
Who's doing what where?
That's right. So then you've got the E2 up at a higher altitude offset, so you can comm relay information to the commanders and all that good stuff. So, yeah, ideally robust package. Sometimes you have to go with what you got.
Yep.
But again, making the decision that if this is what I have and these are the threats I'm seeing, I'm sorry, buddy, you need to bed down. And we'll get all of our stuff together and we'll come back and get you.
And I'll say that's a big part of success in CSAR is training our aviators on what to do as a survivor, how to be a smart survivor. So where is a place to kind of egress to that we've already looked at that we think is kind of clear of threats based on intel as you start whatever mission maybe went sideways for you. So you have that understanding, and then also your standard SEER evasion tactics. And so you're able to kind of keep yourself alive and as viable as possible for us to come in and rescue you. And then hopefully you remember all the little code words and isoprep things that what your first car looked like, that type of stuff, to be able to make sure that we know who we're picking up and we're not being duped into something.
That's right. So each aviator, speaking of isoprep, again, it stands for isoprep. I don't know. It'll be in our...
It's isolated personnel something or other. Report,
okay.
I think.
All right.
It's your oh my God, stuff went sideways. Who are you?
Well, it's almost like nowadays the questions that you put into a website. So if you forgot your password, you answer specific questions that you put in there. And if you answer the questions right, then you get access. When you get authenticated and you answer the question right, then you'll get rescued.
Yeah. No, that's it. It's amazing. That is a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
I remember doing an event in Fallon, and we during that phase in the Navy's evolution, the S3s had moved to the ES3, which had all sorts of amazing sensors on it. And so those guys could find an aviator pretty quickly that was down and then helped us locate where it was as a rescue package. And I remember doing the debrief because, and this was one of our guys in my squadron was the poor survivor. And for some reason, his training isoprep, he had written, "My wife's teddy bear's name is Wellington." And so no kidding, everybody wanted to authenticate him with that. So say wife's teddy bear's name. And that just kept echoing throughout the valleys of Dixie.
That's funny.
Up there in Fallon. And that was one of the debriefs. Okay, we understand that was kind of funny, but we probably need to use more than one thing when we're doing this. So.
Yeah, that's funny. And also, I think one of the other things that I ran into in doing CSAR training evolutions, I never did one in real life, but we always kind of talk about it just like we did. And then you rescue the survivor. And it's oh, okay, good, game over. But no, you're still...
No, it's game over. Because then we're oh, crap, we're on our own.
Yeah, and that was one of the problems that we typically run into. It's when you mention gas, your strike fighters are up there and you have to be rotating because once you rescue them, then, yeah, we can zip on out of there, but we still got to get the helos out. We got to make sure that we close the door behind us, all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot that goes into that full mindset. And that's one of the things we say, train like we fight. A lot of the times I found we had to make sure that we at least paid tribute to that end of that mission so that we made sure that if it came down to real life, that people wouldn't just say, okay, we got him, we're done.
Yeah, we're all done. That's almost more dangerous. Once you've got them on board and you're trying to egress is because in theory now they know you're there.
Mm-hmm.
You've made enough of a presence with the overhead package that people are probably looking for you on the way out. And we divide out how much ammo and go, no-go criteria to say that, hey, I want no more than 25% of my ammo used on the ingress, no more than 50% in the LZ, and then we got to keep something for us on the way back because if I'm all out of chaff or flares relative to the missile threat or don't even have small arms, and we're totally exposed out there. So we're always thinking about that and know that the gas is always an issue overhead. So
we talked about the helicopters, and so a lot of your experience was in the hotel doing this mission set. And so as we think about technology now, I mean, I hate to say it, but it's been a little more than a decade than you and I were actually doing this.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sadly, yes.
And we've got very capable people doing it with very capable equipment out there. Well, some of our listeners, you might be going through flight school and stuff. So what would they be looking at for equipment that has advanced since the time we were doing it?
Yeah, well, I'll say like the concept writ large is very much joint. So I think when at least I started doing this, we had our own like kind of baseball code words of how the event progression was going, and now we have all moved towards a joint publication to understand. And so when stand-in alerts in the Middle East, I didn't know who my rescue was going to be. It might have been the Sandies, and so everybody had to be on the same playbook. So there's a lot more structure with the Joint Rescue Center that's in charge of that. And the infrastructure on comms is huge. Same with the radios. And I would say just as I was leaving, because we started flying the Sierras, we had Link 16, so you can put secure messages in. So communications is always the biggest problem. Like, where are they? Do they have anything? If I'm like tucked in behind a ridgeline, I'm not hearing you call off, hey, you're cleared to press. We like validated. We've done all the things we need to do. It's your time to get in there, and we don't know. So having mids was huge, and that in itself is kind of where the entire strike group is going, where we're going to have secure comms on just about everything. And ultimately the vision is like any sensor, any shooter, any platform. So the battle space awareness should be huge. Now that's, as I'd always joke, my last job before retiring was the requirements officer for naval aviation. I said, if you've got a picture that's got lightning bolts on it, that's where you need to focus to see like how is that really working, and how can we make sure those connections are making sense to the operator and the warfighter so that they're getting what they need in a sensible and timely way to make it relevant. And so I think that is the future. It is the now, actually, more in the future. And overall, we don't even talk CSAR anymore. We talk PR, personnel recovery. And given kind of the lay of the land, again, going back from, a very focused combat operation in a coastal nation or to a near-peer competitor, what does the theory of battle look like? And it is not sending a couple aircraft and a rescue package over the horizon to pick up one person. So we're looking at how do we handle mass casualty at sea? How do you handle that while under fire? How are we going to manage these things? So there's a lot going on conceptually from a planning perspective to think about what's different. Certainly, we're looking at a lot of unmanned technology that we can put out there to at least work the sensor side of the house. But I think the biggest thing that we have and that we're leveraging now is the communication, the secure communication structure, which will allow us to have a lot more insight as to where people are, what's going on, what they need, and to be able to have communications as opposed to kind of that arbitrary, this was my game plan, and I'm going to go here, and I'm going to say my prayers and hope everything works out. There's going to be a lot more understanding and comms with that in the future. So I will say from a helicopter community standpoint, we went from an air wing that had 7 aircraft, 4 Foxtrots and 3 hotels, to 11 helicopters on the deck. And now we've kind of moved back because as we're bringing more assets to the air wing with the Joint Strike Fighter, the E-2D, the V-22 is taking up a lot more space than the C-2s used to. And then bringing in the MQ-25, which will be our first unmanned carrier aircraft. We don't have the space, so we're trying to figure out how best to manage the missions and what we most expect to be called on to do to be effective as a carrier strike group. So there's a lot in work right now in that process.
The constraints of deck space
result
in compromises as we try to figure out what the best complement is.
That's the heart of aviation. Like weight is going to be a problem. So what do you want to be able to do? You want to be able to go fast. You want to be able to go far. You want to be able to pull lots of G's. So it's always that compromise, and that goes right down to home plate and mom on the flight deck. So
one of the things in technology is the radios that we carry on as aircrew, and one of the things I saw in my time was we went from basically it was just a radio to being able to pass messages, very simple messages. It's almost like, the old Motorola flip phones or something, but robust, which was really great because, like you said, communications, if I can't get that audible transmission out and it's not readable on the other side, at least some beeps and squeaks can get across and we can do messaging that way. And I remember carrying something in the cockpit so that we could authenticate through that source. And it allows also, you mentioned of course, if the enemy whose territory you're in knows that somebody went down, they are going to be looking. And so staying off the radios is a good thing. So if it's just beeps, then it's very hard to pick up for the other side to then locate. But are you aware of any kind of, on the survivor side, any advancements?
We are working that now because we're behind. We used to have the C-Cell was the radio that basically kind of plugged into the overarching rescue infrastructure. So as opposed to, as you mentioned, like nobody's sending you a message. They're sending it up to a satellite that's going to the JSRC, which is the Joint Rescue Coordination Center, and they're sending these messages out on the system. So you don't need that line of sight, and everybody has global awareness is, the mindset of how that would work. We are not using the C-Cells anymore as far as I know, and that we are working on what is next in that world. And the way, at least from a requirements perspective, we purchase things is that typically a service is lead for something that's kind of mutually beneficial. So the Air Force is responsible for the radio systems there, and we're going to have different things like, the M code and GPS and a lot more just precise information and data that should be generated, and again at a very secure level, so it's not something that can just be tuned into in the local scanner to so the neighbors know who's where and what they're doing. So that's the objective for the future. It is it's still in work though. It is definitely still in work.
Yeah, and I'm sure it'll continue to be in work, but we look at what's going on with satellites and connectivity, and I think nowadays, if your iPhone is out of service, then you can send text messages through satellites. So,
well, I have this vision in my head of the JO trying to figure out how to work their official radio and then going, screw it, and then popping out their iPhone, and they're like, I'm right here.
That's right.
And people go, oh, hey, I got a text from him. Let's go.
Exactly.
It's kind of naval aviator mindset of like, just make it work.
That's right.
It's amazing the capabilities that exist just in the commercial environment. So
exactly. And so it's not to say that we're just going to issue people iPhones and rely on that. We need to have a robust capability. So good people are working on solutions to capitalize on that technology. So are there any other kind of CSAR points that you wanted to add to the conversation we didn't hit on?
No, I think we covered most of it. Good and bad. I've never had to do it for real. I've always said that as a search and rescue pilot, a good day for me is a bad day for someone else. So I'd rather not start the process, but we want to be ready to be there to affect the rescue and make it into a good day at the end. But I've got to do a ton of training, and I don't know that we highlighted it a lot. Typically, we try and do our events at night to reduce our risk of being seen and compromised, which means you do a lot of night vision goggle flying, which is a whole different world when you're low to the ground. It's basically flying on a green TV screen in 2 dimensions, even though you're operating in 3. That is the challenge. It's also the fun of figuring out how to make all that work and bring it to bear. And I remembered again the survivor, poor guy, F-18 FNG, who got voluntold, and we were off the central coast of California in an area called Hunter Liggett. I don't know if you ever did any operations there. It was as dark as it could be. Like literally, I remember looking under my goggles, and I was dash 2 in the landing zone, and I could not see lead.
Oh my goodness.
And when we got the poor JG in the aircraft and we got him up on the intercommunication system, there were a couple expletives, and he goes, "It's dark out here. I don't know how you guys see anything. This is crazy." And I'm like, "You're gonna be okay.
It's all good now."
But no, like lots of great experiences doing that. As I said, just working with phenomenal people, both from the overarching coordination side as well as like inside the aircraft and the aircrew. So it was a ton of fun.
Yeah, and from the RMC side, same thing. Like I said, never did it for real, but always felt like that we were ready. But I'm glad that we never did it for real. Yeah. So it's a great mission to be ready for.
Yeah.
CNAF, you were aviation requirements. And then take us through the rest of your time and what you're doing now.
So I just recently retired in June. in my quest to try and figure out what I want to do next, I went back home. And so now I work again as a civilian for naval aviation in an office that we call Legacy, which stands for Leadership, Education, Growth, Advocacy, Culture, and Youth Outreach. So it's basically a combination of leader development, talent management policy work, and then youth outreach. And one of our biggest challenges as a community is the fact that about 85% of people who come to fly in the Navy come from military families. And when we have less than 1% of our population serving, we have really truncated who might even think of us as an opportunity for a great career with great folks. And so we want to do our best to get that message out and do it early, because one of our other challenges is that I think we're at about 25% of our recruitable population. So that's somewhere between 17 and 25 years old. Only 25% are even eligible to serve due to health issues, due to drugs, any criminal stuff. It's just a broad array of things that kind of limit who our talent pool is. And so we want to make sure we're focused in on those kids and helping kids figure out what that path looks like. So recruiters talk to older kids because you have to be of a certain age in order to talk to a recruiter. And we focus younger. So we look at elementary school kids, we look at middle school kids, and we certainly talk with high school kids and look for programs that inspire them to think about, you might not like math, but math is pretty cool when you're pulling a 90-degree turn and you're at, 4 Gs and you got to figure out when you're going to roll out and where the groove is so that you can land on the aircraft carrier. That's cool math, right?
That is cool math.
So suddenly geometry looks a little different. And so it's the idea of explaining that these are tools. I once had an engineer say that math is the language of science. And so learning these things and understanding these things and being dedicated to that can lead to exciting work. And the Navy is an opportunity for all who are willing to put in the work. And so that's what we want to get out there. And oftentimes people look at what they think of as a naval aviator. There's the Tom Cruise, and they're like, well, I don't look like Tom Cruise, so therefore that's super special stuff. I don't, it's not for me. I don't know anyone who does it. And so obviously that's kind of unobtainable. And the fact is that we're all just normal people who got the bug at some point, and probably were lucky to have a mentor or somebody who communicated that this was an opportunity, if we walk the right path, to get to go do some pretty awesome stuff. That's our focus, is kind of getting out there. And so we work with lots of nonprofits that support aviation-interested kids, and then also STEM stuff, so science, technology, engineering, and math. And so we get out there, and the best part is sending JOs out in flight suits to be at these places and talk about what they do and tell their stories. And a lot of times that's enough for somebody to go, that sounds cool. I'd like to do that. Another awesome program that we started through ONR, which is the Office of Naval Research, is, again, a STEM grant. So we have 2 HBCU schools that have aviation programs. So they're colleges that in the summertime they bring in kids and teach them how to fly. So they have an 8-week program where these kids are in residence 24/7, learning how to fly, bonding with each other. They get Navy flight suits. We take them on tours. We bring guest speakers in. And by the end of the program, they should be getting their private pilot's license.
Wow.
And
that's remarkable.
It's incredible. It's about the equivalent of a $27,000 scholarship for each one of these kids. And right now we're doing about 28 a year. The program is in its 3rd year, and we select out of the Navy ROTC program and the Navy or Marine Corps ROTC program. And having gone through the applications, it's eye-watering what these kids are out doing. So anybody who says this next generation, we're all hosed, they're wrong. Like, these kids are doing a really amazing things. In fact, my daughter's a freshman in high school, and I'm like, you need to pick it up. This is impressive stuff. Yeah, and about 78% thus far for the last 2 years have either gone into a service academy or a ROTC program. So we consider that a pretty good return on investment. And thus far, so does ONR. So they're continuing to fund it. But those are just like opportunities to show kids like what's out there and what you can do. And once they get the bug, we're hoping that, it's something that kind of takes them through the whole process and they can come to the fleet and do some pretty awesome stuff.
That's great. Amazing opportunities. When you talk about 85% come from military backgrounds, obviously I did, you did. And I thought about that a lot recently when watching football. You got the Shanahans, you got the Mannings.
Oh, yeah. Family business.
Exactly. Family business. And so you think about, okay, so those kids grew up in the football environment. So it seems natural that they would go that way. And Certainly we see that in the military. But like you said, we need more people to consider the military so we can expand the opportunities out there.
Yeah, and beyond just thinking about it, it's kind of demystifying it because I think there are so many biases out there. People think they know what it is to serve based on movies they've watched or shows or video games. And I mean, I was amazed talking with kids where, many people say, hey, it's an all-volunteer service. So these kids didn't think I got paid.
Oh my
they're
goodness.
like, how do you survive, as a volunteer spending all your time doing this stuff? I was like, no, I get a paycheck, and or that you just live in barracks. Like how do you have a family when you're like living in a? I'm like, no, I don't live in a barracks. Like there's times where you do these things, but in training, but you can have a full life, and these are real people. And I think that's the biggest thing. And I think that's why people who grow up in military families, like all that's already demystified.
That's right. That's a great point.
And as I said, sometimes if it seems impressive, as I tell kids, I'm like, hey, every astronaut was a 10th grader at some point in time.
Yeah.
So how do you kind of connect the dots to say these are the steps you take to get there, and this is very attainable. So
develop that North Star and figure out how to get there and make it happen. Yeah, and then you can do 4, 6, 8 years, whatever it is, and that's not the rest of your life. You got a long life ahead of you.
Yeah.
And you've developed great skills.
Yeah. No, I feel blessed. I mean, the Navy paid for me to go to college. I was an exchange student in Australia. They paid for that when I was in college.
We didn't cover that one. Oh, my goodness.
Paid for me to get my master's degree, so getting a paycheck while getting a master's for free. Paid for me to learn how to fly. So it's really amazing when you think about the benefits as an individual that I've been able to receive in my service. And so I almost feel guilty when people are like, oh, thank you for your service. I was like, well, I feel like I've gotten a fair amount back for what I've invested. So
yeah, that's so true. Well, that's great. So where can people go to either follow you or learn more about these programs?
Certainly any of the Navy recruiting sites. And tell you what,
we can drop a link in the description.
Yep. I was going to say, let me do that because I have it on a card, a couple of the different emails and sites, and the CNAF Flight Academy is one of them, which is the program for the junior ROTC folks out there. It's amazing how some don't know or they find out about it a little late, and then they're emailing us like, how can I get into this? And so, hey, your leadership is supposed to tell you, but again, it's anytime we can press those communications. But Navy recruiters will be able to help with this, and it's also pressurizing the fact that, like, hey, I want an officer program that's going to pay for college, and those are kind of the big ones to work through. But I'll make sure that we have appropriate links that we can send to you so you can help get the word out.
That's great. And also, as we saw, there many great people who we worked with in the Navy who started enlisted as an aircrew. I mean, what a great opportunity. And then was able to transition to pilot. So a lot of different opportunities for people to look at.
Yeah, I was blessed because one of my follow-on tours, I was the chief of staff at the Naval War College in Newport, which is also where OCS is the officer commissioning program. And so I had at least 3 or 4 of my former sailors who had gotten their degrees while in the Navy and then applied for the officer program and then went through OCS. And so I got to commission them.
That's cool.
So when you're filling out recommendation letters for them and they're like a third-class petty officer and now you're commissioning them as an ensign, it's pretty awesome. And then you go see them do great stuff, especially because they're typically out of an aviation command. That's the direction they want to go, and they're flying aircraft in the fleet. And you're like, man, that's awesome.
That's good. And to find you out there, MySpace, TikTok.
Close. No. I'm a little bit of a digital immigrant, but not quite that bad. Right. I am on LinkedIn.
Okay, great.
Tamara.k.gram. That's about my digital footprint right now, but I'll do my best to be available no matter what. Because I'll say, like, one of the reasons, again, coming back to naval aviation is, regardless of my job, when anybody would call or email with hey, do you have like 15 minutes just to talk to me about career this or something that, it was always like the best thing. You put the PowerPoint away and you're like, heck yeah. And you get on the phone, and it's that mentorship stuff that really connects everything. And so I'm big on that. And so if there's anybody that ever wants to connect, I'm always available and like to hook people up with the right folks so that they can find the details on some of those paths of doing different stuff.
Great. The last question we have is, and I don't know the answer to this, where's TLO come from?
It's not that exciting a story.
We can make it exciting.
Okay. Well, so I did not have much luck in having a call sign stick when I was in my first squadron. I had my maiden name's Karwoski. They called me Car Wash for a while, Ski, Hammer. Like, there was a million different things. And at one point, and this was, as I'm dating myself here, Tammy Faye Baker
Okay.
was in the news. And so my middle name was Lorraine. And so somebody called me Tammy Lowe. And as you know, if you don't like your call sign, you better hide it because otherwise it will stick. And so I did my best to be like, nope, I'm fine. It doesn't matter. But Tammy Lowe started to stick. And then I got another call sign, and I don't think my mom's listening, so I'll say I had a couple drunken wandering events when I was a young JO and maybe in Fallon. And so I was given the call sign Gypsy. And so Gypsy stuck throughout the second half of my JO tour. And so that was, all my name tags said Gypsy, and that was all good. But I was the first female rag instructor in my community. So when I went to the rag, all the guys over there knew me as Tammy Lowe.
Oh, okay.
And so that kind of stuck around, and then a buddy of mine checked in, and now we'd hit the J-Lo era, and so he shortened it to T-Lo, and then it was done.
There you go.
Once we got it truncated to 2 syllables, it was all good. So
That's good.
So T-Lo has stuck with me ever since, and in the grand scheme of call signs, I will say it's okay.
That's right. Well, and I'll tell you, it is a good story. So that's wonderful. Well, good. Well, I really appreciate you coming out. Here's a little guest patch from
awesome.
Fighter Pod Podcast right there
Thank
for
you
you.
so much.
So
That's awesome.
yeah, well, thanks. It's been a wonderful conversation, very insightful on CSAR and where things are going and the outreach through the Legacy program. So I really appreciate everything you're doing there for Naval Aviation and wish you all the best.
Well, thank you very much. And it's an honor knowing who's sat in the seat across from you and Jello. So really humbled to be here, and I appreciate the time. As always, it's great to just kind of catch up with the extended Navy family that we've created over 30 years. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. Well, great. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time on the Fighter Pilot Podcast.
Hey, thanks for watching this episode of the Fighter Pilot Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something new. I still do every episode. Now, as a quick reminder, we try to explain all the jargon, but in case you missed something, head on over to fighterpilotpodcast.com, where we have a glossary of all the different terms we use. And while you're there, check out some of the cool merchandise that we offer. For additional content and to help support the show, please go check out our Patreon page. We'll see you next week.